more of a continuation of forms of involuntary servitude, which were particularly and overwhelmingly directed at African Americans, persevered in American society. And so my work is primarily about how slavery continued, how slavery was resurrected after the Civil War, and how it sustained into the 20th century and impacted the lives of millions of African Americans, primarily in the rural Deep South, which was where essentially all African Americans remained until well into the 20th century. And so the reality of that history is that after a period of time after the Civil War, during which the formerly enslaved African Americans of the South experienced a period of authentic freedom, varying in its complexion and duration from one place to another, but for 10 or 15 or 20, and in some places 25 years, there was an authentic freedom and an authentic citizenship for African Americans. Lives of great hardship, poverty, deprivation of many kinds of government services, but also in a time when few people received many government services, but real citizenship and participation in American life and political life, and the ability, at least to some degree, to establish independent existences away from the white people who had previously attempted to control their lives. But all of that comes to an end in a much more dramatic way, and that's what I write about in the magazine and in the book, that period of freedom comes to a terrible end, and freedom is literally taken away. And by that, I don't mean that I'm not talking about being called a bad name or people being deprived of the vote or even losing access to the courts or the protections of the police. I mean real enslavement, that a new system of involuntary servitude emerged largely by this, through this exception in the 13th Amendment, and then as white supremacists and others reasserted control in the South, they reconfigured the criminal justice system as the modern criminal justice system was being created. It was built in such a way to use the criminal justice system to force huge numbers of African Americans into hard labor, which turned into essentially the local courts and the state courts of the South selling large numbers of African American men to commercial interests. And so a new kind of slavery emerged, which became incredibly important to the reconstruction of the South economically and the revitalization of the cotton economy, which all of America relied on, the industrialization of many parts of the South. That occurred, and all of these things continued deep into the 20th century, right up to the dawn of World War II on a very, very large scale. And in the end, we don't know exactly how many African Americans found themselves back in a world of being bought and sold, but it clearly was. There's far more evidence about this exists than many historians realize or really wanted to confront for a long time. But hundreds of thousands of people were literally bought and sold, and thousands of African American men and some African American women died under horrifying circumstances. This was a system that relied on brutality and starvation and intimidation. In many respects, a more brutal kind of involuntary servitude than what preceded it, and it became a primary weapon of terror and intimidation to force African Americans away from exercising their civil rights and intimidating them into compliance with the other kinds of exploitative labor that we know more about, like sharecropping and tenant farming. And the repercussions of all of that are still with us. The legacy of that economically and educationally is very much something we can see in the persistent disparity between whites and blacks in terms of economic achievement, educational attainment. And so understanding this history, this grim history that fortunately has come to an end, by and large, the version of it that I describe has come to an end. But nonetheless, we have to understand the enormity of what was done in that period of time, particularly